This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
What is up, everyone? Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. Starting us off, Krista from Romania says, Robert, help. My mom has read Dan Brown's Secret of Secrets and has completely fallen into the noetic sciences rabbit hole. It's quite sad to see, so I'll spare you the details, but do you mind giving us viewers tips on combating this pseudoscience?
Well, first, thank you for sparing us the details. I'm sure it is grim and demoralizing. Dan Brown, novelist, burst on the scene, I don't know how many years ago, with his blockbuster bestseller, The Da Vinci Code. And the Da Vinci Code was world famous. I picked it up once. I read about half of it. And actually, I read about a quarter. Actually, I looked at it and it was fantastically successful. It spawned apparently an extremely mediocre movie, mostly famous for Tom Hanks in a rather unexpected hairdo. And since then, Dan Brown apparently has been cranking out a series of novels that basically have the same structure. You have a sage protagonist, in this case, a Harvard professor of symbology, whatever that is, and he has a colleague who has an amazing discovery, a discovery that's going to overturn everything, just a bombshell that's going to change the way we think about everything, and is giving a press conference the next day to show the evidence. And of course, that morning, they and the evidence disappear, and our protagonist goes on a search for them. And of course, before it's over with, uncovers a secret conspiracy that goes back century, that goes back millennia, that goes back geologic eras of those who are in charge of this mystery. They don't want us to know, and they've hidden the mystery in a multitude of signs and symbols. And so, this sort of thing. Apparently, this book has some feature of noetic science in it, which I was unfamiliar with. And looking up what it's about, mostly what I conclude is they advocate the scientific study of unscientific things. What do we got here? Very familiar turf, conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, all sorts of things where the main point is it's not really provable. And in fact, the fact that it's not provable proves how much you should have faith in it. And the more it's unlikely, the more you are demonstrating your faith in it by sticking with it. And we've got endless examples of that. We've got the everyday versions. We've got ESP and telekinesis and ghosts and astrology and clairvoyance. Then we've got the ones with the strange sort of cosmological focus to them, ancient astronauts that visited Earth, the UFOs that abduct people, where somehow they always involve sticking needles into the stomachs of these people before they're let go again. Then, of course, there's all the medical ones, the phrenology, the homeopathy, the real sources of AIDS and COVID and Ebola virus, and a mountain of wildly destructive gibberish conspiracy thoughts about vaccines and microchips in them, and of course, the autism angle. Very often, they take the form of something everyone says happened, didn't really happen. The moon landing was faked, for example, or the thoroughly execrable notion that the Sandy Hook mass slaughter of little children was staged. Some of the time it takes the form of, yes, this thing did happen, but with different settings and different consequences than people were led to believe. And of course, this is 9/11 conspiracy. This is what actually happened to JFK. This was after World War I, the great betrayal notion in Germany that no, they didn't really lose the war. They were stabbed in the back by the capitalists and the moguls and the Jews and all. And then, of course, you've got the belief that something happened that nobody else seems to know occurred. And nothing gets better than that, than Hillary and her minions and the pizzeria were running a pedophile ring. So, all sorts of versions of that. Of course, some of the most time honored versions of this nonsense, pseudo belief, parapsychology, etc., is driven by vicious hatred of some outgroup. No, your genocide never happened. No, the Holocaust never happened. No, you really weren't born in the United States. Your birth certificate was faked, or much of 19th century Anglo Saxon American hostility to Catholics was run on the notion that the Pope, the papists, had all sorts of plans for taking over the world. And naturally, somewhere in there, you have to have the flat earthers. Now, when you look at this range of beliefs, there's patterns to it, and they've been dissected by various thinkers. Carl Sagan famously tried to understand why people believe in nonsense. The magician James Randi made a career out of showing all sorts of spiritualists what they were actually up to with their circus tricks. One of the most thoughtful is the science historian Michael Shermer, who's written a series of books basically looking at what the structure is of false belief and why people fall for it so readily. Now, one of the easier realms for detecting when it's happening is when someone is presenting pseudoscience as being science. Someone has claimed that they are able to read people's minds, and this is scientifically proven by them. And one of the red flags that should make you a little bit cautious is when they carry out a study where it is not properly controlled. There's no controls. Subjects are not blinded. Here, we're injecting you with this herb that supposedly is going to cause this effect in you, and you know that you're getting it. The person who's giving it to you knows that you're not blinded as to treatment. Then there's the ones where, of course, the core thing is an unfalsifiable claim. If you really, really, really believe in Tinkerbell, whatever it was, she's gonna come back from the dead and resurrected. And if it doesn't happen, it's because you didn't believe fervently enough. It is not possible to falsify that claim. If there's no evidence of independent replication, let somebody else do the exact same thing. And if they don't get the same exact results, there's something problematic here, according to like science 101 kind of thing. Then another sort of route that pseudoscience often takes is to turn the tables, turn who bears the burden of proof. What do you mean? You need to prove there's no such thing as Yetis. Don't ask me to prove that there are Yetis. And this is a variant of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And when you turn the tables instead, and it's the skeptic side to prove that what you are claiming is not the case, then there's all sorts of technical things that pseudoscience can do, something called p hacking, where basically what you do is you run enough measures and comparisons of things, and each one of which gives you a probability of there actually being an effect happening there. And if you run enough of these, simply by chance, one of them is going to come through resoundingly significant. And you can say, by the hard ass stringent rules of scientific statistics, it's been proven this works this way. Then, of course, there's the Woozle effect, which I guess Winnie the Pooh and Piglet were out in search of the Woozle, and they were out in the woods and they were following supposedly the Woozle around some bushes and followed it further around. And then they discovered Woozle footprints. So they followed them around the bush, and then they discovered there were twice as many Woozles and then twice as many, that much more, because they were going in circles. A Woozle effect, somebody makes some unfounded claim in the literature, which somehow gets cited, and the citations of it get cited until it is just given knowledge. Everybody knows this. Or you can have one variant on it where the original study shows 27,000 people showed this effect. And the next time it is studied, it's cited as showing that almost 30,000 people. And then the next one, 30,000 people. And then the next one, more than 30,000. Studies have shown that over the course of reporting basically an unreliable finding, there's often a consistent hyperbolic exaggeration of what simply isn't true. Be suspicious of pseudoscience, where they don't want to show you the data. They're not thrilled about other people trying to come in and replicate. Okay, so all of these are the ways when you can spot when somebody is spouting some sort of pseudoscience babble, techno babble stuff. Now, what's more interesting is the people who think about this, try to understand it, look at what's the cognitive structure of people believing in nonsense. One of the things you see is the underlying temperament, the underlying traits that give rise to someone who is prone towards this, vulnerable towards this. They generalize. They generalize. This is not someone who specializes in nothing but conspiracy theories about beetle taxonomy. This is someone who finds it perfectly plausible to not only believe that AIDS was a conspiracy to make some bioweapon, but it is also perfectly likely that Avril Lavigne was kidnapped and replaced by somebody. Somehow it covers every possible domain there. It also shows an internal inconsistency. A wonderful version of this. You take conspiracy minded people and you give them a whole long list of how likely do you think this is that this occurred, that this was covered up, that aliens have actually done this. Go through a whole long list. And as long as you space the claims far enough apart, people will say yes to two diametrically contradictory things. People will say, yes, Princess Di was murdered by the British Secret Service. And 27 questions later on the questionnaire, they will say, yes, Princess Di is living under an assumed name in Door County, Wisconsin, taking care of cows. There's no internal consistency that's demanded out of the beliefs. Now, Shermer has broken down what some of the building blocks are of this mindset, the cognition that brings somebody into it. One of them he has termed patternicity. And this is something very familiar to psychologists. People look for patterns. People look for explanations. People perceive patterns in randomness. And one of the most important things out there is that when people are anxious, they perceive more patterns. Wonderful studies that could do this. You ask people, for example, how religious they are. I am treading carefully here. How religious they are. And they say, I'm moderately so. And then give them an example of ambiguity, of something that evokes anxiety in them. Give them a bunch of math things to solve that are unsolvable. These puzzles are set up so that you can't get the solution. And afterward, people will say, on the average, that they are more religious than they would have said in the absence of this frustrating circumstance. One root of this is we look for patterns. The other is we have a pretty good primordial bias for running away from predators. If you got a choice between false positives and false negatives, probably good to have a mindset that pushes you towards false positives. Another term that Shermer has emphasized is one that he calls agenticity. There's agents behind things that happen. Something big and consequential occurs, and somebody caused it. And very often that takes the form somebody caused it intentionally. They caused it intentionally with you in mind. Then another notion of his proportionality, really big consequential things that have happened are due to really big causes underneath, which just begs for conspiracy theories. When big old disasters happen, that was because something very ancient and something deeply rooted and reaching far. Big consequences have big machinations that gave rise to them. And that simply isn't the case. World War I was triggered, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, because his driver made a wrong turn. Or, for example, the unbelievable disaster in Bhopal in India some decades ago where 20,000 people or so were killed by a gas leak from a Union Carbide Dow chemical plant. Apparently, most of the damage, most of what could have been prevented was not prevented because at some critical point, everyone decided it was time for a tea break, or evidence that some guy who got sick and couldn't get on the Titanic to do his job, and the guy who replaced him forgot his binoculars and thus wasn't looking. We've got endless examples where tiny little things cause massive consequences. Big things are not necessarily caused by intentional agents. Big things are not caused by big schemes. Nonetheless, this is a theme that runs through a lot of this thinking. Now, underneath a lot of this is something vaguely akin to why gossip is a universal. Every culture you look at, people gossip around the campfire like crazy. Anthropologists constantly document some absurd percentage of what people talk about is gossip. Who's messing around with who in the bushes, who pretended to really do the brave thing in the hunt, but was actually lagging back. And it has been said, gossip is the weapon of the low status individuals. Conspiracy theories are as well. Now, what this is getting to on the largest level is the difference between how we reason our way to a view and how we feel our way to it. Moral philosophy, for example, classic view going back to Lawrence Kohlberg, a very cerebral one. We make our moral decisions by thinking our way to that stance. And what more and more research has shown is no, actually, we feel, we intuit, we gut instinct our way to a moral decision, and what passes for thinking about it is usually post hoc rationalizing. And this is work, this was pioneered by psychologist Jonathan Haidt, New York University, who started a whole school of study showing things like you can show activation of the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, when somebody is trying to make a decision about whether it is okay that this or that be allowed in society, the emotional limbic system in the brain activating before the cortex. And where you can predict what the person's decision is by looking at the limbic system before the cortex has come in with a, oh, I can't tell you why, but it's wrong, wrong, wrong when those people do. Ah, here's the reason why. The cortex has caught up with your gut instinctual intuitive running on often nonsense, running on conspiracies. And a key thing that throws everyone off when seeing this is that very, very smart people fall for conspiracy thinking. And what they're often doing is applying very, very smart reasoning to try to reason their way as to why their purely gut instinct about something was actually correct. Now, of course, what this gets to is the question, how do you deal with this? How do you try to get people out of their beliefs in nonsense and parapsychology and new age, who knows what? One of the things that's clearly not going to work is to just angrily inundate the person with counterfacts, because what you often wind up doing is you convince the person that much more of what they are advocating. And this is one of the great polarized paradoxes of this time, that the clearer the evidence is that this group is advocating nonsense, the more they cling to it because, whoa, look at the big guns those guys are pulling out now to try to show that we're wrong. They must be really scared of what we are about to uncover. So that doesn't work very well. What tends to work is don't ask somebody to go through the facts. Ask somebody to go through the process of how you would be skeptical about this. Okay, so you say that this person is capable of levitating themselves merely by the right mindset. You're saying, what would be involved in disproving that? What would you have to see in order for you to stop believing in it? And that's often a very good way of leading somebody to the core of conspiracy nonsense, which is they're advocating something that is not falsifiable. How could you prove this is not really the case? And no matter which way you do it, the more you want it to happen, the more it proves you want it to happen. The less you want it to happen, the more it proves you were suppressing your desire for it to happen because you wanted it to happen so much. When you take people through logic like that, that's often a good way of getting them into the corner of realizing they're believing in something that is not falsifiable. And a lot of people find this unsettling. Not everyone, lots of people dig in even more at that point. But most fundamentally, what this is about, this is a soundbite that endlessly comes to mind for me. You can't reason somebody out of a stance that they weren't reasoned into in the first place. Don't try to get them with facts. Don't try to get them with logic. Get at what are the fears? What are the emotions? What are the worries? What are the histories of societal abuse, whatever, which brings this person to a point of emotionally being so susceptible to grasping onto something like this? You can't reason somebody out of stances like these when they weren't reasoned into it in the first place.
All right. Next, Mariana from Brazil says, okay, we've all heard about the circle of life and how every life is sacred, but hear me out. What if we just got rid of mosquitoes? Do they actually play an important role in their ecosystems? Dengue fever really wasn't fun.
Well, a wonderfully apt question for this time of year, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, where it's summer, mosquito season. There's two problems with mosquitoes. The first is they buzz around. And of course, when you're trying to go to sleep, there's one and you can never quite get it. And then you get a bite from them and it's itchy and irritating. And the other problem is that mosquitoes kill more humans than any other animal out there is able to do. They kill a vast number of people with the diseases that they carry. And indeed, dengue fever is not fun. There's a whole bunch of these, and these are massively consequential on the planet. Number one on the list, of course, malaria. Approximately 250 million cases a year in the world. 600,000 people die from malaria each year, transmitted by mosquitoes. Most of those who die are kids, and even the ones who don't die, you spike a high fever, and that's a young brain that readily falls into a seizure disorder. You get cerebral malaria. You're going to be dealing with that for the rest of your life. So that's absolutely awful. Dengue fever kills about 30,000 people a year, yellow fever about 20,000, Zika virus causes horrible birth defects, West Nile virus. All of these are mosquito borne diseases, and they are awful. So we've got mosquitoes, and of course, the added feature to their disease carrying is they tend to be infesting and infecting people in the poorest parts of the world. Although late breaking news, the last country on earth that did not have mosquitoes now has mosquitoes, and that is Iceland. So we come to this question here. Do we want to get rid of all the mosquitoes? Now, in beginning to think about this, we don't even want to get rid of all the mosquitoes. We want to get the ones that are problematic. Turns out there's more than 3,500 species of mosquitoes out there, and there's only about 200 of them that bite people and carry diseases. So our question becomes a much more manageable one. Do we want to get rid of all of the dangerous, noxious mosquito species out there? And if you do, how do you do it before you even get around to deciding if it's a good idea or not? And scientists are working out a number of techniques for doing this. Probably the most successful is taking this bacteria that infects mosquitoes and infects all sorts of insects, but it infects mosquitoes. It's called Wolbachia. And what it happens to do is it kills the dengue virus. So you got a mosquito, and inside the mosquito is a bacteria, and inside it is the means to kill the virus inside the mosquito. And not only that, but when a male mosquito that is infected with this bacteria mates with a female, she's made sterile by him. And that's great. That's totally wonderful. And best of all, it doesn't do anything adverse to humans having this Wolbachia bacteria in you. And all sorts of research and field experiments are being done now where you generate mosquitoes that are infected with Wolbachia. How do you do that? Well, it starts in the fertilized egg that's going to give rise to the mosquito. The egg is infected with the bacteria because the mother was infected. So how did the mother get it? Back when she was an egg, and then you see turtles all the way down. But nonetheless, Wolbachia-infected mosquitoes have been bred literally in the billions. The World Mosquito Program on trying to eradicate this raised one of the truly chilling, queasiness-inducing sort of things I've read in a long time. So you've got this breeding place. The first original one was in Brazil, and this was this place that was breeding billions of these bacterially infected mosquitoes, getting them healthy and peppy and full of zest, and then let them go loose and be fruitful and sterilize females all over the place. And while you still got them, you got to feed them. How did they feed them? This was the horrifying detail. It said the protocol there was heavily sedated mice would be set upon by mosquitoes, and on the average, about one mouse a day was completely exsanguinated by these massive numbers of mosquitoes. That was totally disturbing. It seems to work. First field trial was done in Indonesia, where they released billions of these infected mosquitoes. And what they showed was by the next year, there was a 70% drop in the incidence of dengue fever. Then the same group tried it in rainforest populations in Colombia, 90% drop in the incidence of dengue fever. So this is a very, very effective strategy. Then the best footnote to the story that shows that today's topics have actually been one interrelated theme. Conspiracy theories started in Indonesia that somehow, because the male mosquitoes who were infected with this thing were sterilizing the female mosquitoes, the male mosquitoes, if they bit you, you would become sterile. Then there was for a while the theme, the Jakarta Post had to have a whole debunking of this, that if you were stung by these male mosquitoes that were infected, they carried the genes for homosexuality and would pass it on to you. This is like the time that Donald Trump mistook transgenic mice, genetically engineered to express a gene that is not normally found in a mouse, to study its effects. He mistook transgenic mice for scientists who are making transgendered mice. So, somehow or other, these Wolbachia mosquito males that were sterilizing females were supposedly transmitting the gay genes to the population in Indonesia, and the usual sort of stuff, death threats to the scientists, facilities being attacked and burned down. We know this drill. So, hooray, conspiracy theories have snuck in the back door in that one. Another strategy. This is a more mechanistically challenging one, which is to make genetically modified mosquitoes that are able to kill the malarial parasite inside them, and thus they can't pass it on to a human. Or a third strategy that's having some success is to just make vast numbers of sterile males, irradiate them so they're sterile, and let them loose and hope that they are strapping studs, and all sorts of females choose to mate with them rather than an actual fertile one, and suddenly there's a lot less mosquitoes. So people are actually figuring out some techniques that are making some inroads into controlling disease-carrying mosquito populations. So that now brings us to the question, would you want to do this if you could get all these techniques together and eradicate every single mosquito on Earth, or at least of the species that are carrying diseases that make us crazy and sick? Would you want to do it? And I got a very surprising result of my reading about this. Would this be a good idea? Would this be tempting the fates and Mother Nature? Would this be a disaster? And surprisingly, not only does it appear as if it would not be that big of a deal if we got rid of all of the bad mosquitoes on Earth, but all sorts of conservationally minded, tree hugging, bleeding heart folks who study living systems and ecosystems agree that the odds are it would not be that consequential if all the mosquitoes disappeared. And this was advocated, two different sources that I found among a number of possibilities. A 2010 paper in Nature entitled A World Without Mosquitoes. And the conclusion was it wouldn't be all that different. And another in the Medical Journal of the Armed Forces of India did the exact same analysis and reached the same exact conclusion. Turns out all sorts of things eat mosquitoes, birds and bats and reptiles and amphibians and fish. There's hardly any of them where most of their diet is dependent on mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are just a side snack. There's even this one kind of fish that's called a mosquito fish, which it turns out it doesn't actually eat mosquitoes as that big a part of its diet or so. There's not a whole lot of impact. And what all the people say is, if the mosquitoes would disappear, these predatory species, they would go for some sort of other insect. Bats, for example, studies have shown less than 2% of the insects that bats consume are mosquitoes. They're about something much better, getting moths. The remarkable thing is, most people said that if you get rid of the disease carrying mosquitoes, most ecosystems would kind of re-equilibrate fairly quickly. You don't get that view very often when you're going and messing with Mother Nature. A few downsides are speculated to possibly be of significance. In some cases, mosquitoes do some pollinating. They don't do a whole lot of it, and there's not a whole lot of flower species that are dependent on mosquitoes to be fertile unto the next generation. Where there's probably the biggest consequences is the last place on earth I would think about mosquitoes, because I know nothing about living in this sort of place. Up in the Arctic, Alaska, northern Canada, northern Russia, famously, horrifyingly massive, massive swarms of mosquitoes every thaw, enormous biomass of mosquitoes, and migratory birds there are very dependent on those mosquitoes. Here's the second horrifying thing I found out over the course of reading about this: massive, staggering swarms of mosquitoes, which make the caribou crazy. The caribou change their migratory patterns to avoid the mosquitoes. And here's the thing that brought me to a gasp: that these swarms of mosquitoes can be big enough that they will asphyxiate caribou by getting into their nostrils. And okay, so that may change migratory patterns of caribou. But the good news is there are no Arctic mosquitoes that carry any of the diseases that humans worry about. So, weirdly, in our green planet mindset, it may not be all that consequential if we got rid of all the mosquitoes that carry some horrible diseases. Finally, something that conservatives and liberals can agree upon, that we probably could get rid of those things. Of course, there's always the law of unexpected consequences and Murphy redux, but that seems to be the surprising answer from those in the know.
As someone who is a mosquito magnet, this was the greatest news, the highlight of my week, I have to tell you. And on that note, I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.